Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, I'm going to talk about the news that came out today at the time of me recording this, that James Gunn has released the DC Slate for the DC studios going forward. Obviously, the plan that him, Peter Safran, as well as some other writers have constructed. This is obviously only part of the first chapter. This is only a section of what's going to be like the 8 to 10 year plan that they've kind of had set up. Obviously, there's a lot of information. If you haven't seen it already, there is a video where James himself explains it. I do believe I think Peter Safran's probably been interviewed or whatever, so because some of the articles I was reading had statements from him as well, but the video in particular I saw was just James Gunn talking about it. So if you haven't seen that video already, I'll include a link to it in the description down below. So first and foremost, let's start off with some information that we learned. First and foremost, just about the DC Studios situation going forward with this DC situation. Obviously, we already knew the information about, like, right, everything is connecting, movies, TV shows, animated stuff, video games. This first part of chapter 1 is referred to as Gods and Monsters, which I'm like, oh, that's such a good title. That's going to be kind of like, I guess, like the overarching title for this first part of chapter 1 of the DC studios. Obviously, there's some conversations that have come up like, okay, so what are they officially going to do about the Batman and Todd Phillips' Joker? Anything that isn't falling under the umbrella of the DCU is going to be referred to Elseworlds stories, which we've kind of gotten that front. I mean, they even did a special of that with the Arrowverse, a 3-part special called Elseworlds. So everyone was kind of already on board with that thought process, but now having official clarity of, like, these are official Elseworlds stories, and anything that doesn't fall into that canonical main line of the DCU will be Elseworlds, so that way the Batman can do its own thing with everything related, like the Penguin series and stuff like that, and also Todd Phillips' Joker too, fully do, and everything. So I'm recording this a little bit later on because I forgot to talk about this, but James Gunn did talk about the movie situations. Obviously, it's like Shazam Fury of the Gods is coming out, and saying that, yes, Shazam has always kind of been on its own, so I don't think that's technically falling into the Elseworld side of things. Maybe I didn't get full clarity on that, but that's eventually going to lead into the Flash, which gives you your reset. Blue Beetle kind of gets that, I think, because of the nature of its story and because of the probably smaller scale it's going to be, you're still able to kind of play in the wheelhouse of, like, yes, that could still be its own thing, while also leading into the Aquaman movie. So kind of saying, like, obviously the conversation has come up of, oh, these movies are lame ducks. What's the point of watching these movies when they're not part of the cinematic universe? It's all part of, like, connective story. Like, these are remnants of the past in some regards, but still could be future stepping stone and blocks for the future, especially like in the case of the Blue Beetle and Flash. Once again, where Shazam seems like, once again, especially because of the more mystical side of things, it probably can kind of stay in its own lane. Probably the same thing in some regards with Aquaman kind of getting folded in, because who knows, like, once again, the aftermath and the effects of Flashpoint, what that's going to look like, especially this version of Flashpoint, what they're going to keep, what they're going to change, how that whole situation is going to play out. Those are conversations we won't fully know the full fallout of until later on down the road, but we kind of got some beginning ideas at the very least of, like, yeah, don't count these out yet, basically. One of the first projects out is going to be something called Commando Creatures. Basically, Rick Flag is leading a team of, I guess this feels borderline Doom Patrol slash Legends of Tomorrow's, like you're getting a cast of, like, misfits, but it seems like it's also, like, monster characters. Like, Weasel's going to be a part of it, which is interesting because James Gunn had said, like, they're casting people, and it's like, right, because it's an animated movie, I believe. No, correction, it is an animated series on HBO Max. It's a 7 episode series. I don't know if it's going to be like a one and done type of thing, but they're setting it up so whoever voices the characters for the series will most likely be will be playing them live action wise. So that's why they're casting that way, which is going to be interesting because at least Weasel was mocapped by Sean Gunn, right? I don't know if he's gonna, because I don't think it's going to be the same Weasel from the Suicide Squad, even though he's still alive. Still could be. Once again, early details, or maybe that information's out there, but based on the article I'm reading, it didn't say anything. So once again, there's still stuff they're keeping close to the vest. But Rick Flag leading a team, that's definitely interesting to have Rick Flag back, especially considering James killed him in The Suicide Squad, so that's interesting. But it seems, like I said, it's like a monster team because there's like Frankenstein's monster and then like the Bride of Frankenstein too, and some other characters I know nothing about. I think we're probably like, this is interesting too because we're leaning into the supernatural. I think more maybe science fictional in some regard, but maybe supernatural elements of we're just like leaning into monster characters like that. So I think that's going to be interesting. Once again, know nothing about this except with the exception of Rick Flag and Weasel, who I know from The Suicide Squad. I have no like bearings or real knowing about any of the other characters. Next up is a live action Amanda Waller series just called Waller, which we will have Viola Davis returning. This was something that was talked about previously in news, that they're like announcements, and based on what the article I was reading was saying, because I don't think James Gunn said anything official, but like I said, this article has a little bit more than what he said in the video, and like I said, maybe it's somewhere else out there he said this, but it's taking place in between season 1 and season 2 of Peacemaker. He hasn't written season 2 of Peacemaker yet just because of everything else on his plate. But yeah, it's going to follow Waller, and one of the people behind it is Jeremy Carver. I believe he's the one who developed Doom Patrol. And the way James Gunn was talking about, like, oh, it's going to be wild and everything. I'm like, whoa. Are we going to get like a Amanda Waller show? I doubt it's going to be like nuts like Doom Patrol, but if we can get anything in the veins of Doom Patrol and like have like Amanda Waller be kind of the straight man to like the absurdity and chaos that is the DC universe, when you get into the like the weirdos like the Doom Patrol, then I'm all for it. So I'm interested to see kind of where that ends up going and who she interacts with character wise, because everything is connected. When you pull something in, it's going to be canonical. So I'm so curious to see what that series looks like. Because I think they also said that there are going to be potential characters from Peacemaker pulled into it as well, which we know Peacemaker introduced Adebayo, her daughter. So kind of playing into that relationship, getting to see them interact more than the one on-screen interaction they had in season 1 of Peacemaker would be pretty dope to kind of like dive into that dynamic even more, especially in the aftermath of season 1 where, spoilers, Adebayo like betrayed her mom. So this is going to probably be her kind of dealing with the aftermath of that, but I'm sure she's going to come up smelling like roses, because it's you don't take down the wall like that. Waller's too good at what she does, but maybe she still suffers some ramifications, and like she kind of gets knocked down the totem pole and she has to kind of rebuild herself as they kind of try and blacklist her thing. I don't know, there's so many facets and so many elements they could kind of directions they could end up taking at, so I think that would be pretty dope. Also, one of the people behind it too I should also include is someone called Crystal Henry, which they said Watchmen, which I'm assuming maybe this is someone who was, I can only assume, connected to the Watchmen show, and I'm like, yo, anyone from Watchmen want to help do something DC? Yo, okay, cool. I don't like, that's awesome. So you compare like bringing in a little Watchmen with some Doom Patrol, like doesn't mean it's going to have that flavor, but having people with those pedigrees behind them, I'm like, dude, even more reason why I'm like, that seems so interesting. So I'm excited to really see what that ends up being when it eventually comes out, when we kind of get a better understanding of what to fully expect from this series. The next thing on the list was Superman Legacy. Those other things are going to be released first, but this is kind of like the official like big tentpole thing, and as we knew before, it is not a like full-blown reboot as in like, oh, it's gonna be an origin story. It's like, no, he's been Superman for a while, and it's about him balancing his life as what he is as a Kryptonian versus the lessons and being the person that he is in being raised by the Kents. And I love the description of like, right, we're not going to get so caught up into like, oh man, it's just a really good guy, because that's who Superman is, versus the really bad guy. They drop particular names like Gorilla Grodd and stuff like that. I don't know if that means it. They're probably just like using big time supervillain names. Maybe there's some correlation there. Maybe they're villains that like Superman has already kind of dealt with in his pedigree. Like, I doubt this ain't gonna be like a year one like Batman, but this is probably gonna be a couple years into it. Kind of probably similar to kind of like Smallville, how Smallville ended with like, it was like the ending was like 7 years into Clark being Superman, basically, I think, officially Superman. So, but I do like that they're talking about like, this is more so about the gray area when it comes to Superman. and just kind of like the complex characters around them. And like, I think you being this morally uphill person, but having to deal with like, yes, not everything is not so black and white. There are so many shades of gray, and having to be this moral pillar in so many different regards, and having to deal with those morally gray decisions, those morally gray characters, is going to be really interesting. Because I feel like Superman and Lois, the TV show, does a really good job capturing and capitalizing on those type of things, of like the complications of being Superman in a way that I think I've never really seen. I mean, sure, there's comics that have tackled it, but like live action wise, I've never really, like, that responsibility as a human. I talk about it constantly because it is one of my favorite Superman and Lois things, is the conversation Clark has with Jordan about trust. That's literally the title of the episode, that every time he uses his power, that trust between him and the general public of the world is being tested. And also, like, the fact is that Clark wants to be the hero for everyone, but he has restraints, because it's like, whoa, like, you know, there are ramifications for you just kind of helping anyone in the world, like, especially because it's like, right, the U.S. government has their interests, and it's like, you're kind of going up against American interests. Once again, certain aspects that Superman and Lois tackled, I'd be curious to see if they end up tackling any of that in the Superman movie. But I'm excited to see what it ends up being, what the full scale of it is. Like, you know, yes, I'm curious about the villains, but I'm curious at what stage in Clark's life this is, because I think this is still early days of him working at the Daily Planet and stuff like that. Like, you know, probably seeing the building blocks, that a relationship between him and Lois, and I'm assuming Jimmy, because I think I've heard about Jimmy Olsen being this, because obviously he was kind of killed off pretty quickly in the Snyderverse, you know. So either way, I'm really interested to see what the story ultimately ends up being, and, you know, what ends up happening. Next up will be a Lantern show. Now, this is something that's been in the works for a very long time. I think a while back they you know, because it was something Greg Berlanti related, and they were going to pump a lot of money into it, but then they kind of like scrapped it, because I think they started heading in a new direction. Well, I believe the first one was like going to be like Kyle Gardner, maybe. What we now know is it's a Hal Jordan and Jon Stewart. I mean, Jon Stewart's definitely like the more popular one, but I feel like when people think the Lanterns, these are the two that kind of typically rise to the surface, especially for Jon, because of the animated Justice League series. I think kind of put Jon Stewart on the map for a lot of people who weren't well versed in the comics or anything like that. But anyway, the way it's kind of described is kind of True Detective, because yeah, the Lanterns are basically space cops, so kind of leaning into that, which almost makes me wonder, is that meaning that every like season or whatever is going to be very anthology like? Because he said like these two are going to be the pillars that you follow, but there are going to be other probably definitely other characters, and probably like other Lanterns sprinkled in. So I am curious, like, could it be like, oh, one season is going to be the Hal Jordan season, the other one's going to be the Jon Stewart season, or is it going to be a thing of like, no, they're kind of cooperating at the same time, doing their own? I'm curious like how that it's going to like fully work. But you know, once again, this is something that's been in the works for a long time, and they've shifted stuff around and changed stuff. So I am very curious to ultimately see what this product ultimately looks like. There's also talk about something involved called the Ancient Core, and it seems like, based on what the article was saying, that this is going to be a major focal point for the overarching story. So this is going to be one of those major everything is important, everything's kind of bleeding into each other, but this thing in particular seems like this Lantern stuff is going to be very important setup for some of the future story overarching stuff that we're going to be getting. Next up is something called The Authority. Now, apparently these are characters from Wildstorm comics that kind of now ended up purchased by DC. I don't know if this is something that happened like a while back, that, you know, once again, this comic book space isn't a space that I'm fully familiar with, so I don't know if it's a situation of like, oh yeah, this happened a long time ago, or if there's something in a more recent time frame. But basically, it's, as James Gunn kind of put it, like, it's going to be a very different take on superheroes. Like, I don't think it's going to probably be as nihilistic as The Boys, but it's probably going to go a little more peacemaker-ish, where it's like, right, we want to do the right thing, but it's also, we will go about it any means necessary. If we have to kill people, then we have to do that. We have to topple government officials, we're going to do that, because it's all for the greater good, the ends justify the means type of thing. And so it's going to be interesting to have characters like that in a movie and see how that contrasts with other characters in the DC universe, when you like have that smack dab against someone like a Superman. It's all about truth, justice, you know, the moral high ground type of situation where you have these characters who believe themselves to be in the right so much that it's like, who cares what we have to do it, as long as the end result is, like, the world is so broken, we need to fix it by any means. And that's where you kind of get into those complicated, morally gray characters where it's like, right, you're going about things the wrong way for the right reasons, but once again, will the ends justify the means when you kind of go about things your way? I think it's basically, I think what I was reading, the project is still, like, obviously in the phase of them figuring it all out, but just that concept alone, I was like, oh, that's really interesting to see what their place will be amongst the DC rank, amongst the this universe, where they stand, and like I said, and what contrast that puts them in with the rest of the DC universe. Like, who agrees with them, who disagrees with them, who will stand beside him, who will stand against him, stuff like that. Then you have Paradise Lost, which is going to be an HBO Max series. This was something that was talked about previously, about making a Themyscira show, and it seems like we're getting that, but we're kind of getting like that history of Themyscira. Like, maybe you might eventually see like a young Diana, but this is all going to be stuff before, like, pre-Wonder Woman, which is also a conversation that James Gunn had said, like, right, Gal Gadot does seem like she's interested, but nothing's finalized. So what that ends up being, like, would you even see a Diana? Kind of learning about how Themyscira became what the juggernaut that it is, becoming the land that it was. And I think that's interesting too, with a title like that too, Paradise Lost, of what it was and then what it eventually became. I think that kind of plays into like what made it the paradise that it initially was, but what changed it to make it no longer that paradise. Conversations like that, like maybe they weren't always the warriors that they were, but they had to adapt because of changing circumstances. So stuff like that's really interesting, kind of getting the past of Themyscira like that. It's going to be pretty dope. Obviously we got a little bit in the Wonder Woman movies, but kind of having an entire series kind of dedicated to that would be really interesting. Next up is going to be Batman the Brave and the Bold, which is interesting. It's an animated series that I didn't like. I watched little bits here and there. It's a series I want to go back to, but obviously this is going to be a Batman movie. This is going to be our introduction to the DCU Batman. So that's definitely going to be interesting, because obviously Brave and the Bold is apparently a very specific comic book run, and this is what they're kind of more so pulling from. So that's definitely going to be interesting to see, I don't know, just tonally and feel and vibe, comparing it to Matt Reeves' The Batman, which is also going to be interesting too, because this isn't just going to be, oh, Batman. This is going to include Robin, Damian Wayne in particular, which I'm like, that's why. I mean, obviously, this is crazy on so many levels, because movie-wise, we have not had a official Robin since Chris O'Donnell in like the Joel Schumacher Batman movies, I want to say. I mean, that was the same thing for like Batgirl. Like Alicia Silverstone was the like last live-action Batgirl in the movie. Obviously, we've had other like Barbara Gordon's like pop up, and obviously we would have gotten one in Batgirl. That's what kind of makes that even sadder. But tangents and all that aside, this is a very unique situation. The fact is, we're not even like, I mean, for one, it's like, and that's a point that was kind of being made too, is like, right, we don't get that many Robins. Like, they were setting up Joseph Gordon-Levitt in the Dark Knight Rises as maybe like becoming like a Robin-esque character, becoming Batman after Bruce like bails from the role and stuff like that. And obviously, once again, we've seen like animated stuff. We've gotten Titans. We've gotten like, even though that's live action, but we've also gotten the video games kind of, extending like beyond like Batman and having the extended Bat family, which is going to be part of the conversation too, because it seems like we are going to get other featured members, and the question then becomes like, oh, okay, so who and when? Because obviously, I think they were apparently James Gunn was playing coy about people like, oh, what about Dick Grayson? Which is interesting, timing wise. Obviously, I'm not trying to drag this into that conversation, but Titans exists, and that is, and obviously people make the argument that's more of a Dick Grayson show than it is a Teen Titans show. Yada yada, so on and so forth. But it's like, yeah, because they did that, would they be so quick to pull the trigger on doing a Dick Grayson related thing in this? I mean, what's also interesting too, because Damian Wayne is the one that hasn't been touched on live action wise, because even Titans has done Dick Grayson as, spoiler, he's already Nightwing. You have Jason Todd, spoiler, he already became Red Hood, and you have Tim Drake in the process of training to become the new Robin. So, and they even kind of like teased a Stephanie Brown in that, just because of that. So like that's also another thing, like cool, like, you know, what other Robins might we have seen, like who already exist in this universe? Does a Dick Grayson already? Does a Jason Todd? Has a Red Hood thing already happened? Tim Drake? Is there a Cassandra Cain in this? Is there a oh god, is there a Kate Kane? Like, you know, once again, the extended Bat family. I mean, has Cassandra, is she orphan? Is she no? Is she? Yes, she becomes orphan because she was Batgirl. But I was thinking of Stephanie, who becomes Spoiler. That's what I was about to say, Spoiler. Like, she becomes, like, stuff like that. So that's definitely going to be interesting. And once again, having a Robin from the beginning is going to be wild. That, you know, kind of already like, no, we're already established. I've been Batman. I've already got my sidekick. And it also makes it interesting because Batman and Robin have always had that son-father complicated relationship. Now it's like, obviously that's always been the point of Damian too. It's like, no, I mean, for one, my mom is Talia, you know, so it complicates that, you know, being part of that family, and obviously Bruce's connection to that Al Ghul's in that regard. But you know, it's like, right, taking Damian, who grew up an assassin, and having that lineage, and Bruce trying to mentor him, because let's face it, Damian has always been depicted, and most people will tell you Damian's a little shit. You know, he's kind of a little prick, so kind of finding that middle ground, what it means for Bruce after all he's been through, all that he's lost. Once again, we don't know what his relationship is like with the rest of the Bat family in his continuity, and also him trying to raise Damian and pulling him away from what he was involved in to where he is now, and that contrast is such an interesting element that I'd be very, very excited to see what that story looks like. Kind of like, once again, not just starting with any Robin, starting with Damian, at least like for our jumping off point. Once again, what the continuity looks like, would have to wait and see. We're going to be getting also a live action Booster Gold series, which Booster Gold has been on that lane for a lot of people, being like, when are we going to get something Booster Gold related, especially considering we are getting a Blue Beetle movie, which I know like Blue Beetle and Booster Gold are tight. Like that's a friendship a lot of people like really get behind, like those two characters bouncing off of each other. So it's actually, there's an interesting thing because if you're unaware, Legends of Tomorrow, I know not a lot of people watched it, but on DC's Legends of Tomorrow in the final season, they introduced their Booster Gold. It was going to be, spoiler, played by Donald Faison, which I was like, oh, that would have been pretty sick to be able to get that, but obviously they're going to go their own route with this on HBO Max as a live action series. But yeah, like I think Booster is a very interesting character. Like, oh yeah, I'm from the future, I'm going to come back to past because I know all these future events, I'm going to make myself into a big time hero. Once again, I always forget, but I want to say he was like wasn't he like an athlete that his career kind of crashed and burned, and he wanted to be special, he wanted to feel special, and you know, along the journey of kind of being this loser and trying to make a name for himself as a hero, along the way he finds out what it means to be a real hero. So I think that's going to be interesting, and especially like I said, if we can tie that in with the Booster Gold stuff, that would be pretty with the Blue Beetle stuff, sorry, that'd be pretty dope. So I'm excited to see who they end up casting and what the story ends up looking like. I think it just could be such a fun series to kind of play around with. You know, especially time travel wise, I'm a big fan of time travel and stuff like that. So the next thing is Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow. Now, apparently this is specifically taking from a Tom King comic book, which I know, once again, not the comic book person, but from what the story is, seems really interesting. There's always been that, I mean, I feel like across most continuities I've ever seen, it's always been that element of, right, Clark has all been Superman for a little while, and then Supergirl comes into his life. And it turns out like, oh wait, then, you know, they've always kind of been a little bit similar, but probably still kind of going about things their own way. Well, this story is basically, apparently Supergirl was on a rock section of Krypton when it blew up, and she kind of had to stay there for like 14 years, and like having to watch it. Like, Clark knows about the history of it, he didn't have to watch Krypton explode. She had to watch everything she knew, everything she's loved, all that she's ever known get destroyed. And so what that does to her, that makes her a little darker, a little edgier, a little more pessimistic, and in contrast with a Superman who is kind of seen as, yes, having his own complications, probably dealing with his own darkness, but that contrast a bit like who Superman is versus who Supergirl is in this particular version. There's even, I'm going to butcher her name, is it just Sasha Calle? She's the actress who plays her in the Flash movie. There's been conversations about whether or not she'd continue over as Supergirl in this regard. Once again, nothing's finalized, but I think that particular approach to Supergirl is going to be interesting, because I mean, obviously, if you didn't know, we had the Supergirl series on the CW. I really enjoyed it. Once again, I know that didn't fit everyone's cup of tea. Once again, the CW stuff in general, but that's fine. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I love Melissa's portrayal of that character. Like, yes, she had her down moments. She had moments of darkness, but she was definitely not a very jaded person. She was very hopeful and held on to that hope. So I think this also sets this Supergirl apart. Very different circumstances in a different environment, how much that can psychologically shape a character and make them kind of have even more of an edge to them in her case. And just like, I think it does a really good job of already setting like this Supergirl apart from that Supergirl alone, or maybe even the Supergirl you typically would associate with when you think of Supergirl. And finally, we're going to get a Swamp Thing movie, which I'm very excited about. I'm so curious to see tonally how this feels. If we could get some semblance of what we got with the Swamp Thing show, that was sadly canceled off of DC Universe, I would love that, because that was such a really good show. In my opinion, I know there were some people who didn't like it, but I thought that was such an interesting take. As someone who has like only slight memories of Swamp Thing, and more specifically the like there was like an animated movie or TV show I would watch related to Swamp Thing. That's kind of my only memories, because it's not a character I'm well versed in. I mean, I know obviously a little bit about the character just because of like Injustice 2 and stuff like that. But yeah, that show was kind of my first knowledge of Swamp Thing, and them kind of going about it the horror route that they did was such an interesting thing, because like nothing DC wise had really leaned into the horror yet, so it kind of being a little bloody, a little horror-esque, I thought was really interesting. Once again, no, it didn't work for everyone, but I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I was so bummed when that show, there were extenuating circumstances that show's cancellation, especially because it got canceled after one episode. It's a whole like production thing that ended up just being a whole thing. But being able to get more Swamp Thing, because I know there was talks previously about doing a Justice League Dark, where that kind of falls into everything, because this could still be like the foundational setup for that in that regard, including a character, because I know, well, I don't know if that's changed or not, because obviously there's a conversation about Keanu Reeves returning in a Constantine 2, because they were going to reboot the TV show, because there was a TV show that was kind of a reboot of Keanu Reeves' movie, but it was with Matt Ryan, who eventually got rebooted into the Arrowverse, popping up in the Arrowverse, and then eventually joining the Legends and that whole rigmarole. So, because they also did mention that none of the movies are all going to tonally feel the same, so that makes me go like, okay, please tell me we will get a little bit of that monster horror, because that's what I really, like I said, really enjoyed about the show, was like we've never had like the point of view of like the good guy being like the bad guy monster in some regards. Like, yes, I know some people don't like this, the evil Superman storylines, you kind of get in that regard, but getting it from like the main character being kind of like the monster and kind of dealing with that in a very superhero fashion, I thought was so interesting. So I'd love it if the movie was able to kind of take that approach as well. So obviously these are just some of my thoughts. I'd love to get to know yours in the comments down below. It is, once again, Tuesday, January 31st. This won't be going up until Friday, which will be February 3rd, so maybe even more information will come out, but I wanted to make a video where I kind of got to share some of my thoughts about everything. So like I said, these are mine. I'd love to get to know yours. What did you like? What did you not like? What are some things you expect from the future? But let's not focus on the future too much. Let's focus on what we know for now. But if you want to kind of trail off on based on what we got in this part 1 of chapter 1, what are some things you think we could see down the line? What are some things you want to see down the line? Just let me know all your thoughts about all of this. But really, that's all I wanted to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.